Good afternoon. My name is Ben Rifkin. I'm Dean of Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today. The Ronald J. Sutherland Lecture, which is what we have here today, is named for our former trustee, Ronald J. Sutherland, who endowed the annual event in 1998 because he believed that providing Hofstra students with an exposure to a wide range of ideas was central to the success of their liberal arts education. Ronald J. Sutherland served on the Hofstra University Board of Trustees from 1992 through 2001. Joining us for today's lecture, we are delighted to introduce Mrs. Denise Sutherland and Mrs. Paige Sutherland. And Mrs. Sutherland and Ms. Sutherland, we're honored that you could join us today. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can I have a round of applause? Previous Ronald J. Sutherland lecturers have included the poet Robert Pinsky, novelist Salman Rushdie, presidential biographer Robert Caro, historian Deborah Lipstadt, urban affairs specialist Fred Siegel, Governor Mario Cuomo, New York Times journalist and commentator Bret Stephens, editor of Commentary magazine and former speechwriter for Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush, John Podhoretz, former Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, General Barry McCaffrey, Columbia University law professor Philip Hamburger, University of Chicago political scientist William Howell, and George Mason University law professor Ilya Soman. To this illustrious list today, we now add the name of Max Boot, historian, author, national security analyst, and journalist with the Washington Post. Today's lecture is made possible not only by the funds generated by the Ronald J. Sutherland Endowed Lecture, but also with generous support from the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication, the Joseph G. Assman Distinguished Scholar Fund for the Hofstra Cultural Center, and the Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Lectures Fund, all of which are donor-supported gifts. I extend special thanks today also to Atheline Collins, Executive Director of the Hofstra Cultural Center, and all the staff at the Cultural Center for their support in helping today's lecture happen. Max Boot is an historian, best-selling author, columnist, and national security analyst who has been described by the International Institute for Strategic Studies as one of the world's leading authorities on armed conflict. He is the Jeane J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, a columnist for the Washington Post, and a global affairs analyst for CNN. I think you can see him tonight on CNN. Max Boot's latest work of history, The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam, published by Norton Liveright, was a New York Times bestseller and finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. It was praised as an epic and elegant biography by the Wall Street Journal, judicious and absorbing from the New York Times, and a superb scholarly achievement from Foreign Policy. Max Boot was also the author of another book released by Norton Liveright in 2018, The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right, which was described as a devastating dissection of conservatism's degeneracy in America by Andrew Sullivan in New York Magazine and as soul-searching and refreshing by the New York Times. Max Boot is the author of three other widely acclaimed works of history: The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power from 2002, War Made New, Technology, Warfare in the Course of History, 1500 to Today from 2006, and New York Times bestseller Invisible Armies, The Epic History of Guerrilla Warfare from Ancient Times to the Present, 2013. Max Boot has advised military commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan, and his books have been assigned reading by the military services. He was a senior foreign policy advisor to the presidential campaigns of John McCain in 2008, Mitt Romney in 2012, and Marco Rubio in 2016. He has been a columnist for Foreign Policy, a blogger for Commentary, a contributing editor to the Los Angeles Times, a member of the USA Today Board of Contributors, and a regular contributor to many other publications, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He is a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, where he took his BA in history, and Yale University, where he got his master's in history. Born in Moscow, he grew up in Los Angeles and now lives in New York City. After his lecture, we'll have Q&A, and students will prioritize student questions first, and then if there's time, questions from community members at that microphone. So we'll ask you to come to that mic. And after the Q&A, Mr. Boot will be happy to sign copies of his books that are available for purchase at the back of the room. And now we add to Mr. Boot's extraordinary list of accomplishments that he is the Ronald J. Sutherland Lecturer at Hofstra University. Please join me in extending a warm Hofstra welcome to Max Boot.
Thank you very much, Ben. Can you hear me? Does this mic work? Okay, you can hear me. What a delight to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to the Sutherland family for making this lecture series possible. Thanks for all of you for coming out. And it's hard for me to imagine a more important topic to discuss in the world today. And let me begin by making a confession. My name is Max, and I am a recovering Republican. Now, the story of how I came to be both a Republican and a former Republican is told in my book, The Corrosion of Conservatism, but I just want to briefly go over it here with all of you today and then talk about what drove me out of the Republican Party and where we stand today with the challenges facing the Republic. Now, the reason I became a Republican in many ways is the fact that I did not start off my life as an American. I like to say that I was born in a country that no longer exists, although it is sadly being recreated at a rapid pace. I am a native of Moscow in what used to be the Soviet Union, now in Russia, and came here in 1976 with my mother and grandmother. In fact, Ben over here worked with my mother, who was for many years a professor of Russian at UCLA. And I like to say that I would not even be here today if it were not for neoconservative foreign policy, because in fact I was one of many Jewish refugees who was able to leave the Soviet Union, come to the United States in the 1970s, thanks largely to a piece of legislation known as the Jacksonvanik Amendment, sponsored by Senator Scoop Jackson of Washington State, a hawkish Cold War Democrat who believed it was important for the United States to uphold certain ideals in our foreign policy. And this was not something that realpolitikers like Henry Kissinger or Richard Nixon believed in, but it was something that Senator Jackson championed, and many of his aides who were involved in that legislation went on to work for Ronald Reagan. And so it was kind of, I guess, overdetermined in some ways that I would become a Republican, because like this was the case with so many people who fled communist regimes, whether it was in Vietnam, Cuba, the Soviet Union. We all tended to gravitate towards the most anti-communist wing of the American political spectrum, which of course in the 1980s was the Republican Party. You know, and I grew up in LA, in Southern California, very much enamored of the Republican Party and enamored of Ronald Reagan, and his moral clarity really spoke to me. When he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," that really resonated with me. I could never possibly imagine that a few decades later we would be hearing another Republican president say, "President Putin was very strong and firm and powerful in his denials." That is a twist of fate that I could have never possibly anticipated. But I grew up in suburban LA in the 1980s and went to school at the University of California at Berkeley, which, as you might imagine, was not a conservative hotbed. But I was happy to make waves. I was battling political correctness decades ago at UC Berkeley, and I knew I was having an impact, and a positive impact, when one day the Daily Californian, where I wrote my columns, actually received a bullet in the mail that had my name on it, literally had my name taped on it. So I knew I was getting through to some people, and that kind of cemented my view that I was on the right side of history, because I felt like the people who were on the other side could not engage in argument, could not engage in debate. They tried to intimidate, they tried to silence free speech and dissent. And growing up, I really grew up in the 1980s, in the era when, for one brief shining moment, conservatism was cool, and the Republican Party was the party of ideas. That was in the days when people like Jeane Kirkpatrick and Bill Bennett and so many other PhDs, including, by the way, George Shultz, were serving in the Republican administration of Ronald Reagan. And of course, I'm very proud today to have an endowed chair at the Council on Foreign Relations named after Jeane Kirkpatrick. And my heroes growing up, and this is to reveal what an uber nerd I was growing up, I did not have a picture of Farrah Fawcett in my bedroom. I did not have a picture of Steve Sachs or even of Joe Montana, who was my athletic hero growing up. I had a picture of Winston Churchill. So I've come out of the closet. You know my deepest, darkest secret. But I really thrilled to that kind of moral clarity. And my heroes, although again, as you might have surmised from my brief mention of Joe Montana, I was and remain a devoted follower of the San Francisco 49ers. You know, I never had any illusions that I was going to follow Joe Montana or Jerry Rice to gridiron glory. Man's got to know his limitations. But my idols growing up, the people I wanted to emulate, were folks like George F. Will and William F. Buckley Jr. Those were the people who spoke to me as conservatives. And one of the formative experiences of my youth, as I recall, was, I think it was around 1984 when I was in high school, and I drove with my parents across the valley from the San Fernando Valley, where I lived in LA, to UCLA, where my parents taught. And Bill Buckley was giving a talk there, you know, kind of at a forum like this one. And I was just thrilled to see him in person. And I was so incredibly impressed because he was so erudite, so witty, and he dealt with hostile questioners with such wit and grace and dignity. It was truly a marvel to behold. Needless to say, he never threatened that the people who were questioning him were going to leave the auditorium on a stretcher. He fought his battles with polysyllabic words. So that was the conservatism that I grew up in. That was the era that I grew up in. And, you know, seeing the Berlin Wall crumble when I was in college, seeing the Soviet Union collapse, it basically confirmed to me the rightness in every sense of my views. It confirmed that Ronald Reagan knew what he was doing when he stood up to the evil empire, that the kind of moral clarity and vision that he represented was in fact the wave of the future. I believed with Francis Fukuyama that liberal democracy was going to be the wave of the future, and I believed that the Republican Party was going to be the party that would stand up for freedom and democracy. And, you know, after having been a campus conservative and campus troublemaker in high school and in college, I very rapidly became a part of the conservative movement. After grad school, I went to work for a couple of years at the Christian Science Monitor, and then in 1994, I reached what I then thought of as being the pinnacle of my life. I was hired at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I had grown up reading the Wall Street Journal editorial page. This was the premier forum for American conservatism, and finally, at the tender age of 24, I was going to work at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I couldn't imagine how life could be any better. Then within a few years, by the time I was 28, I was the op-ed editor of the Wall Street Journal, determining all of the signed articles that ran on the opinion pages of the journal. And I was writing for the journal as well. And I really felt like I was part of this movement that was greater than myself, and it stood up for ideals like the slogan of the Wall Street Journal, which was free markets and free men, now changed to free people. But the idea being that we stood for free enterprise capitalism, we stood for greater immigration, we stood for free trade, we stood for our allies, our security alliances, limited government. These were the ideals of conservatism as I understood it. That's what attracted me to the conservative movement. It has been a rude awakening to see how conservatism has been transformed. You know, my previous Reagan-esque understanding of conservatism was one that I espoused, and not only at the Wall Street Journal, but subsequently when I left the journal, I went to work at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I've been a fellow since 2002. And as I mentioned earlier, I had a chance to work on the presidential campaigns of John McCain, Mitt Romney, Marco Rubio, and to fight for some of these beliefs that I have long espoused. Now, fast forward to 2015, and a very different kind of Republican enters the Republican presidential race. I still very vividly remember that day when Donald Trump came down the escalator at Trump Tower and began attacking Mexicans as rapists and murderers. My immediate reaction is unprintable, but suffice it to say, I was appalled, I was outraged, I could not believe this. This is not the way you're supposed to talk in American politics. And it was especially bizarre for me because Ronald Reagan was somebody who championed immigration. In 1980, he talked about making America great again, and he talked about making America great again by welcoming immigrants and about the contributions of immigrants. He wasn't denouncing immigrants as rapists and murderers. He was talking about immigrants as being the people who built America. So here was a very different kind of Republican who was castigating Mexican immigrants in these very crudely xenophobic terms. And then within a few weeks later, Donald Trump attacked John McCain, saying he was not a hero because he was captured, and Donald Trump did not like people who were captured. Now this again was an oh my God kind of moment for me, because John McCain was one of my heroes, somebody I truly revered, loved working for, thought he was one of the greatest Americans in our history, somebody who suffered for our country in ways that few people have done. And here was somebody who had avoided the Vietnam draft attacking one of our greatest war heroes. And a Republican presidential nominee and a leading Republican senator, how on earth could he possibly get away with this? I thought very naively. But then, of course, the outrages piled up. Remember Donald Trump making fun of a disabled reporter. Remember Donald Trump saying that he was calling for a complete and total shutdown of all Muslims coming into the United States. And I remembered how after 9/11, George W. Bush had been very careful to say that we were not waging war on Islam, that Muslim Americans were good Americans, that this was a perversion of the religion that we were fighting against. But here was Donald Trump basically saying, we don't want any Muslims in this country. I could not believe that this was a person who was seeking the nomination of my political party. And I was very naive in those days. I thought, oh, you know, sure, Donald Trump is getting a lot of attention, but he's basically like a carnival freak. He's a sideshow attraction. Of course he's getting a lot of airtime, but of course, you know, when Republicans actually get it's time to vote, they're going to get serious. They're not going to nominate somebody like Trump. They're going to vote for a real candidate, somebody like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, whom I was working for at the time. I did not think that Donald Trump would win a single primary. I thought he would just be a flash in the pan, which shows you how little I understand either the Republican Party or American politics. The most amazing transformation was the one that happened in the Republican Party, because I'm old enough to recall how Republicans thought about Donald Trump at the beginning of 2016. It actually wasn't that long ago, although it seems like it was a different geological age by now. At the beginning of 2016, I did not know a single conservative or Republican who had anything positive to say about Donald Trump. Today, by contrast, it's almost impossible to find a single conservative or Republican who has anything negative to say about Donald Trump, at least in public. I mean, that is an astonishing transformation. It is something I would have never believed could possibly happen. I mean, I was alive in 2016. I actually remember what people were saying at the time, although they would rather forget. I remember when Lindsey Graham called Donald Trump a race-baiting, xenophobic bigot. I remember when Ted Cruz called Donald Trump a pathological liar. I remember when Rick Perry called Donald Trump a cancer on conservatism. I remember when Marco Rubio called Donald Trump a con man. Okay, that is not normal political invective. That is not the kind of rhetoric you normally hear in a primary of any political party. You're not going to hear Democrats referring to one another over the course of the next year as a cancer on the party, or as a con man, or as a bigot. You're not going to hear that. It wasn't normal for Republicans to be saying this about Donald Trump, but it was true. They were calling him out for what he was. So I was just so astonished. I could not believe it, that after having said all this, you then had these very same Republicans endorsing the race-baiting, xenophobic bigot, endorsing the cancer on conservatism, endorsing the con man, endorsing the pathological liar. They turned around and pretended as if they had never said those things. I remember calling a senior aide on the Rubio campaign when Senator Rubio endorsed Donald Trump, and I said, "What the hell? Wasn't Marco just saying like 2 days ago that he was never Trump? What happened?" And the lame response I got was, "Oh, he was never Trump in the primaries. He didn't mean never Trump in the general election." So apparently there was like a little asterisk to his never Trump that I had not realized was there. This was, to me, this was just astonishing. Wow, I mean, if you think that somebody is a cancer on conservatism, if you think he's a bigot, if you think he's a con man, if you think he's a pathological liar, how on earth could you possibly decide to give him control of the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet? I mean, what kind of logic lead somebody to do that? Well, I had exposure into the kind of logic that made this happen when I had a backyard cookout in Washington, as I recall, in the summer of 2016. This was when Donald Trump was well on his way to winning the Republican presidential nomination. And I had a friendly cookout with one of my close friends who had been a senior official in the George W. Bush administration. And I said to him, you know, A, I don't think that Donald Trump can possibly win. He's not going to defeat Hillary Clinton, which shows, again, how little I know about American politics. But B, I said, I don't think he should win. This is not a guy who ought to be president of the United States. And so therefore, I said, for the first time in my life, I am going to vote for a Democrat. I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton in the fall. And my friend said to me, oh, Max, you're so naive. You think that politics is about ideas. I said, yeah. I mean, what is it about if it's not about ideas? I thought the reason we were supporting the Republicans was because the Republicans represented our ideas. That was me and my naivete. Well, my friend explained to me, no, that's not the way it works. He explained to me, politics is essentially tribal. And Donald Trump is the chief of his tribe, therefore, he has to go with the tribe. This was a revelation to me. I mean, this was not, you know, an unemployed steel worker in Scranton who was saying this to me. This was somebody with a PhD, somebody who was part of the Republican and conservative establishment, somebody who had worked in a pretty senior policy position in the Bush administration, and he is seeing politics as essentially a tribal exercise. And in hindsight, he was right. I was naive. This is actually how a lot of people view politics. They view allegiance to the Republican and Democratic Party the way they view allegiance to, let's say, the New York Giants. It's not because the New York Giants play a certain style of football. It's not because they have a certain set of players. You may have been rooting for Odell Beckham last season. You'll be rooting for somebody else this season. You're basically rooting for the uniform. You have this tribal identification with the football team. Or around here, I suppose I probably ought to be saying the Jets, right? Not the Giants. But whichever team you happen to root for, it's basically tribal. And what my friend was revealing is that a lot of people think about politics in the same way. And that's why they're able to reverse their positions on issue after issue to support Donald Trump, because he was the chief of their tribe, and also because they believed this fanciful and exaggerated tale that was told by the Republican propaganda machine, by Fox News and others, about how Hillary Clinton was going to destroy this country. Hillary Clinton, who was so conservative that a lot of Democrats couldn't support her because they thought she was too conservative, but she was going to be this left-wing revolutionary who would destroy America. In fact, one of my fellow Berkeley alumni, a fellow named Mike Anton, wrote this famous pro-Trump essay called The Flight 93 Election, in which he compared the election to a plane hijacking where terrorists have taken over the airplane and you have to rush the cockpit and the plane may crash and everybody may die, but if you don't do anything, you're certain to die anyway. I mean, this is a pathological way to view American politics, where you're viewing your opponents not as good Americans who have a slightly different set of ideas about how to approach policy, but you're viewing them as an existential threat to this country, which justifies almost any measure that you will take to prevent them from taking power. This is what happens in dictatorships. This is how authoritarians think. This is not how democracies function. But this is the viewpoint that took hold in the Republican Party in 2016. And I think that explains a lot of how we've gotten to where we are and why even today Donald Trump enjoys 80 to 90% support in the Republican Party. Now, when I talk to my Republican friends, or more accurately, my former friends in the Republican Party, and ask them, how on earth can you possibly support this charlatan, this con man, somebody who clearly, to my mind, is taking advantage of his followers to gratify his own ego and not to serve the larger country? How can you possibly support somebody like that? And I always, get kind of a set of justifications. The economy is doing great. Tax cuts, very good. Supreme Court appointments, great. He supports Israel. And there's that's usually the litany of rationales for supporting Trump. My own view is, okay, you can argue about those individual things, and some of them are good, some of them less good. I mean, for example, I'm not sure why we need to add $1.5 trillion to our debt when the economy is already basically at full employment, which is the result of the Trump tax cut. But okay, I get it. Some people think that the tax cut is a good thing. That's an arguable position. That's the kind of policy step that probably any Republican president would have been implemented. But what I say in reply is, okay, I will grant you that Trump has done a few good things. I'm not saying that everything he has done is awful. No president is 100% awful, but you have to weigh in the balance. Are these handful of policy priorities that you like, which you would have gotten with any Republican president, is that worth the massive cost that you are paying? And all these things that Trump is doing that no other Republican, no other president of any party could ever possibly do. And to my mind, it's not a close call that the disadvantages vastly outweigh any possible advantages, even if your viewpoint is a conservative one and you're basically sympathetic to what some of the policy steps that Donald Trump has taken. To my mind, this is not about policy. This is about who is fit for office. This is about what kind of country we are. This is about how we preserve our democracy. It's not an issue about what should the tax rate be or who belongs on the Supreme Court or whether we should recognize Tel Aviv or Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. These are all issues on which reasonable people can differ, and I actually agree with Trump on some of those issues. But I don't agree with what he is doing to the country, and I certainly don't agree with what he is doing to the world. As I mentioned, one of the reasons I became a Republican in the first place was because of the moral clarity exhibited by Ronald Reagan in standing up for democracy and standing up to dictatorships. And by the way, even standing up for democracy in friendly dictatorships like the Philippines and South Korea, and pushing for democratic transitions in those countries. By contrast, Donald Trump has never met a dictator that he wouldn't kowtow to, with a handful of exceptions like the dictator of Venezuela. He certainly has no problem kowtowing to dictators, whether in Beijing or Riyadh or Moscow. There is no moral clarity there. And at the same time that he is extraordinarily soft on dictators, he is extraordinarily hard on our democratic allies, constantly denigrating allies, whether Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada or Chancellor Merkel in Germany, in ways that he never speaks about Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, it's a striking disparity that he insults our allies in very personal terms and never has a cross word for Vladimir Putin. He undercuts NATO. He badmouths the rest of our allies. He imposes tariffs that are doing grave and possibly irreparable damage to the free trade system that the United States has championed since 1945. I mean, if you were an American ally, why would you trust the United States ever again? And most of them don't. I mean, if you actually look at the polls of support for the United States in ally after ally, it's been a precipitous plunge since President Obama left office. Our allies have no confidence in President Trump, and for obvious reasons. And frankly, if I were an ally, I wouldn't have confidence in the United States either, because I would know that even once President Trump leaves office, the isolationist and protectionist sentiments that he caters to, they're still going to be there. And there's still a good chance that some future president will cater to that same set of prejudices. So if you're an American ally, you know you can't really count on the United States in the future, and essentially you're going to have to think about making accommodations with regional bullies, whether it's China or Russia, Iran, North Korea, whoever. That, I think, is one of the upshots of his presidency. And so I think he is doing grave damage to this international system that was constructed by the greatest generation after World War II. And it's just striking to me that one of the many things that we take for granted about Donald Trump is his foreign policy is actually called America First. I mean, what was America First? That was the movement of Charles Lindbergh prior to World War II, which was sympathetic to the Nazis, and that was isolationist, and that did not think that the United States should stand up against fascist despotism around the world. That is the name for his own foreign policy that President Trump has adopted. That, to me, is very striking. Even if he had no idea what America First was all about, he has had time to learn. And the message it sends, I think, is that we're back to essentially a pre-World War II mindset, a 1930s isolationist mindset, and that is an incredibly dangerous message to be sending in a world with as many predators out there as exist today. But although I'm a foreign policy guy and I've spent most of my career writing about national security policy, I do not believe that the greatest danger that Donald Trump poses is to our foreign policy. I think the greatest danger that he poses is right here at home, to our domestic policy, to our domestic tranquility and well-being. Because Donald Trump is not a uniter, he is a divider. And the way that he divides our nation, I think, is incredibly corrosive and harmful. It didn't start with Donald Trump. We were already becoming bifurcated along partisan lines before he came into office. But he is exacerbating those trends, and I think leading us to the most dangerous division of our country that I've seen in my lifetime, certainly. I was born in 1969, and this, I think, is really the most divided we have been since the 1960s, when we had actual blood in the streets. The way that he divides Americans, of course, is along ethnic and racial lines. We have never had, certainly not in my lifetime, a more openly racist president. The only figure that I think he is comparable to is George Wallace. But George Wallace did not become president of the United States. I mean, the way that Donald Trump talks about African immigrants coming from shithole countries, the way he says there are very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, and the very fine people who were marching in Charlottesville, they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Let's remember that. The way he scapegoats highly paid African American NFL players for not standing to protest police brutality. 1,000 other things, and certainly the way that he scapegoats immigrants, which has been one of his fundamental political appeals, essentially blaming newcomers from Latin America for everything that Donald Trump's supporters don't like about their country. I mean, essentially what he has done is he is channeling these grievances, and he understands that the grievances are out there in these Midwestern industrial states that have lost their industry, that have lost hope, that are being ravaged by an opioid epidemic. I mean, these are serious problems which are many decades in the making. It has to do with the economic transformation we're going through from an industrial to an information economy. There are many winners, especially on the coast, but there are also many people who are economic losers as a result of these changes. The pain is real, the grief is real, the economic dislocation is real, but Donald Trump is not offering real solutions to these real problems. What he is offering is basically scapegoating people with darker skin color to suggest that they're actually the problem, that the reason why you don't have a job, the reason why your town has lost its steel mill or auto plant is because there are all these caravans coming from Latin America to steal your jobs, which is blatantly untrue. It's false. He constantly talks about immigrant crime, even though every study that's ever been done shows that immigrants actually have a lower crime rate than native-born Americans. Even undocumented immigrants have a lower crime rate than native-born Americans. And yet he constantly harps on immigrant crime as if this is the greatest danger threatening America. I mean, it's a very transparent ploy. It's one that's been used by many populists and authoritarians in the past. You scapegoat some minority group, and in return you hope that the majority group will rally to your cause. I mean, that is what Donald Trump is doing. It's a successful political strategy for him, but it is morally despicable. It is wrong. This is not the way you should be winning office in the United States. And I am appalled to see that so many of my, again, former friends in the Republican Party are going along with this. And I'm certainly not one to say that all of Donald Trump's supporters are racist. That's not true. Many of them have other reasons for supporting him. But what I will say is this, that while not every Donald Trump supporter is a racist, every Donald Trump supporter does not believe that his open racism is a breaking point, is a reason not to support him. They can overlook his racism and find other virtues, whether it's the tax cuts or judges or whatever else. For me, I'm sorry, I can't do it. This has been the most important issue in America since the beginning of our republic, and the fact that he is so openly appealing to white sectarian prejudice, for me, even if he did nothing else, that would be a deal breaker. But there is a lot else, unfortunately, that he is doing that I just consider to be fundamentally unacceptable from a president of the United States, regardless of what you think about his policy views. Look at the way that he refers to members of my profession. He calls the media the enemy of the people. Folks, this is not the way that leaders of democratic republics talk. This is the way that Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler talked. They called the press the enemy of the people. This is authoritarian language. This is incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly corrosive. Of course, why does Donald Trump hate the media so much? Or at least he purports to hate the media. He actually loves the press when it gives them favorable coverage. But the reason he calls the press the enemy of the people is we call him out on his falsehoods. And there are a lot of falsehoods to call out. My employer, the Washington Post, there's a fact-checking team that does a Herculean job of tracking all of Donald Trump's statements. And as of April 1st, they had compiled 9,400 falsehoods that Donald Trump had uttered since becoming president. Almost 10,000 falsehoods in about 2 years. That's about 12 a day. That is off the charts, okay? Donald Trump makes Richard Nixon seem like an honest man by comparison. I mean, I know that there is this prejudice that all politicians lie. I get that, and I think it's certainly true that all politicians shade the truth. All politicians lie a little bit. But we have never, ever, ever in this country seen a politician who lies an average of 12 times a day. That is off the charts. And these are not these are not slips of the tongue, as Sarah Sanders would say. These are deliberate falsehoods that are repeated time and again, even as you see the media trying to correct them. Donald Trump tells his followers, no, don't believe the enemies of the people, believe what I say. I mean, this is truly Orwellian. It's truly bizarre. I mean, you see it even this week where he is tweeting that the so-called angry Democrats of the Muller report, who wrote the Muller report, which he claims exonerated him, but at the same time he's attacking. So you have to figure that out. But he's saying that this whole investigation was started by the Democrats, by the Trump haters. It's all a plot and a conspiracy, which we know is not true, because if you read the Mueller report, you know how the FBI investigation of Donald Trump started. It started not with the Clinton-funded Steele dossier. It started because George Papadopoulos, the Trump foreign policy aide, found out in advance that the Russians had hacked the Democratic National Committee and were going to release those emails, and he got drunk and shot off his mouth in London to the Australian ambassador. And our allies in Australia were alarmed enough to notify the FBI, which then launched an investigation. That's how it started. It's documented. This is not my opinion. This is a fact. But Donald Trump does not believe in facts. He is trying to knock down facts. He's trying to knock down the truth. Very, very dangerous. And that, of course, is why he is knocking down the news media. Of course, he also attacks Democrats and his critics in general in ways that are well beyond the pale. Of course, we've always had partisan disagreements in this country, but we've never had a president, certainly not that I'm aware of, who refers to his political opponents as traitors to the country. That is what Donald Trump is now doing routinely. He is referring to Democrats and his critics in general, including never Trump conservatives like me, as traitors, as treasonous. Okay, folks, that is how absolute monarchs talked in the 17th century, where criticizing the king was viewed as treason against the kingdom. That is not the ethic upon which this country is founded. The kind of the DNA of our democracy is that you can have honest and vigorous disagreement. You don't question the motives of your opposition. You accept that there can be honest disagreement, and that there are many ways of demonstrating your loyalty to the country. And certainly the test of your loyalty is not whether you support the current president or not, that there are higher loyalties to the Constitution, to the Republic, to the country at large. But Donald Trump does not recognize any of those higher loyalties. His only test for whether you're a good American or not is, do you support Donald Trump or not? That, to me, is fundamentally corrosive to the very idea of our democracy. But in some ways, beyond the racism, xenophobia, attacks on the press, attacks on the opposition, all those things are bad enough. But I think in many ways, the greatest threat that Donald Trump poses to our democracy is his assault on the rule of law, which is something that is going on every single day. Just this week, for example, Donald Trump is attempting to prevent his current and former aides from testifying to Congress. He is suing to prevent his accounting firm from sharing information under a lawful subpoena from Congress. He is defying the clear text of the law of the Internal Revenue Code, which says that the IRS shall furnish the tax returns of any taxpayer upon the request of the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. It doesn't say may furnish, could furnish, will furnish if there's a good cause. It says shall furnish, but Donald Trump is disobeying the law by essentially directing his Treasury Department not to furnish those tax returns. This is part of a pattern of attacking the rule of law. Just a few weeks ago, before the Muller report came out, there were reports that Donald Trump was telling the head of the Customs and Border Protection Service not to allow immigrants to make lawful claims for asylum in this country. He was telling them, tell them this country is full and to go home, and if you go to prison, I will pardon you. It's hard to imagine a clearer abuse of presidential power than something like that. He is not taking care that the law should be faithfully executed as called for in the Constitution. But of course, the greatest Donald Trump assault on the rule of law is the one documented in the Mueller report. And I would strongly urge all of you, if you haven't done it already, to go home and read the 448 pages of the Mueller report. It is gripping reading, even though it is not a thriller. But what it tells you is the truth about the Trump administration, and it does it in a way that I think is truly irrefutable, unless you are truly a blind partisan. Because as I mentioned, Donald Trump constantly attacks the fake news media. He calls us the enemy of the people because he doesn't want people to believe what we have to say. And sure, occasionally the media gets things wrong, although I think we're far more right than wrong. But look at the Mueller report. This is an investigation headed by somebody who was a Marine combat veteran of the Vietnam War, somebody who was a lifelong Republican with the best prosecutors and FBI agents working for him. And he certainly did not he did not find Donald Trump guilty on every count. In fact, of course, Donald Trump is trumpeting the very fact that Mueller said that you could not establish beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a criminal conspiracy on the part of Trump with Russia to undermine the 2016 election. And so Donald Trump is shouting full exoneration. Well, my view, folks, is that there ought to be a higher standard for the President of the United States than whether it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he has committed any felonies. Okay, should not be the qualification for holding the nation's highest office, and that's something that Republicans agreed with once upon a time when they were impeaching Bill Clinton, and it's something they don't agree with anymore. But I would say that the first volume of the Mueller report, even though it does not document actual crimes in Mueller's estimation, what it documents is a terrible dereliction of duty. It documents a presidential campaign that put self-interest above the nation's interest, that acted in ways that were not patriotic. Because what the report shows is that time after time, the Russians were interfering in our election, were trying to undermine the sanctity of our democracy. And instead of speaking out about that, instead of notifying the FBI about all of their contacts, 140 with the Russians and their intermediaries, the Trump campaign said, I love it. If it's what you say it is, I love it. They were welcoming a Russian attack on America for their own partisan political purposes. That is not a president who is upholding the Constitution. It gets far worse in Volume 2 of the Mueller report, where Mueller lays out clear evidence of obstruction of justice on the part of the president. And of course, the Republicans are now saying, well, how can there possibly be obstruction of justice if Trump was not guilty of criminal conspiracy with Russia? Well, funny, they didn't use that logic with Bill Clinton. I mean, what was it that Bill Clinton was guilty of? Well, he had a dalliance with Monica Lewinsky. That's not against the law. What he was guilty of was lying about that dalliance, which was not an illegal act. That's why Republicans wanted to impeach him. And for that matter, Richard Nixon, did he order the Watergate burglary? There is no evidence that he did. Why was he impeached? Because he was covering up the Watergate burglary. He was obstructing the rule of law to cover up the actions of his subordinates, even though he was not personally criminally liable for what his subordinates were doing. Well, what Mueller establishes is that time after time, Donald Trump was guilty of obstruction of justice. If you actually read the report, you'll see that Mueller examines 10 incidents of possible obstruction of justice on the part of President Trump. And in 6 of those instances, he establishes that Trump's conduct met the 3-part test for proving obstruction of justice in a court of law. In other words, if Donald Trump were anybody in the world other than the President of the United States, he would have been indicted already for obstruction of justice. As Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, tweeted a couple of days ago, this would be an easy case for any experienced prosecutor to bring and to win because the evidence is so clear-cut. The reason he didn't bring charges is not, as Attorney General Bill Barr suggested, because Mueller wasn't sure what the evidence added up to. It's because the Justice Department position is you can't indict a sitting president. And Mueller is bending over backwards to be fair. He is not a partisan hack. He is bending over backwards to be fair because he takes the position that if he cannot indict Donald Trump, he also cannot even in a report say that Donald Trump broke the law because that would be accusing him of a crime and not giving Trump an opportunity to clear his name in court in a speedy and expedited fashion. So that is why he did not draw the obvious conclusion. But if you actually read the report, you know what the conclusion is. You know that he obstructed justice. What's staggering to me, and this is not a surprise to me, I mean, a lot of this obstruction of justice happened in clear sight. We all saw it happening, for example, when he fired FBI Director Jim Comey and said, I did it to stop the investigation of the Russia thing because the Russia thing was crazy. I mean, he was admitting obstruction of justice that was occurring in plain sight. But what's staggering to me is not only it occurred in plain sight, but now Robert Mueller has amply documented it in a very meticulous, methodical, legal way, examined every possible Trump defense, knocked them all down, and shown why, yes, this is actually a violation of the law. And what is the Republican response? It's basically ho-hum, let's move on, nothing new here, let's not waste our time. I mean, I truly did not expect the fact that the only elected Republican who would show any outrage over the Mueller report would be Mitt Romney. And even Romney minimized what Trump had done by suggesting that he had been cleared of obstruction of justice, which is not the case. But at least Romney talked about how sickened he was by this kind of conduct from the president and his aides. For the other Republicans, it's basically the sound of silence. And if they say anything negative, it's something incredibly mild, like there's some inappropriate conduct here, or there are a few troubling things, or as the senator from Iowa said, Donald Trump is sort of brash. Yeah, I don't think brash is quite the word that I would think of when describing somebody who commits obstruction of justice and welcomes a foreign attack on the United States. The words that come to mind are high crimes and misdemeanors. But there is no chance, if the Democrats bring a case of impeachment, which I think would be amply justified on the facts, I think there's basically no chance that you'll get a single Republican voting for impeachment, probably in either the House or the Senate. They can still pass impeachment in the House, but it's certainly not going to lead to conviction and removal in the Senate. And so then you have to make that very difficult calculation that Nancy Pelosi is now making about, is that worthwhile to do? Is it worthwhile to send that signal of disapproval, even though it could potentially backfire and energize Trump supporters? That's a very difficult case to make. And, you know, I'm fine with whatever decision Speaker Pelosi makes. I have a lot of respect for her acumen and judgment. But what's staggering to me is this incredible abdication of responsibility by the Republican Party, which used to claim that it was the party of law and order, which used to claim it was the party of family values, which used to claim it was the party of character and dignity, and it assailed Bill Clinton for degrading the office of the presidency. And I agreed with a lot of those criticisms, but it's staggering for me to see the Republican Party now defending somebody like Donald Trump, who is not just offending our sense of dignity and decorum. He is actually breaking the law itself. He is a threat to the very fabric of our democracy. And the Republican Party has become an enabler of that. They have become a supporter of somebody who has the instincts of an authoritarian, even though he does not have the capacity to act on his instincts because of our strong checks and balances. And that, to me, is just a staggering development. It's something that I would have never imagined starting off as a Republican in the 1980s, that this is where we would end up with this. You know, one way that I put it is that for most of my life, the Republican Party was a conservative party with a white nationalist fringe, and now it's become a white nationalist party with a conservative fringe. something I never imagined happening. It's also become a de facto, in many ways, authoritarian party whose only animating philosophy is to give Donald Trump whatever Donald Trump wants. And Republicans are terrified to criticize him, even when his wrongdoing has been laid out so meticulously and authoritatively by the special counsel, because they're all terrified that they will, be on the receiving end of a nasty Trump tweet. I mean, it's staggering to me that we ask our soldiers to risk their lives for the Republic, and Republican office holders will not even risk their jobs for the Republic. That is a staggering dereliction of duty on the part of the Republican Party, which has become Donald Trump's enablers. I mean, to me, this is, this is something obviously that all of you know and can understand what I'm talking about, but for me, this is not just a hypothetical intellectual matter. For me, this is very real. This is very personal. This is about a party that I really devoted my life to, a movement that I devoted my life to, and I'm wondering, in hindsight, what the hell was I thinking? Were they always like this all along and I just didn't perceive it, or have they changed? I'm just not sure. It just feels like a lot of my conservative and Republican friends have had their brains sucked out and replaced with Trumpian mush. And it's just staggering to me that this has happened. I'm kind of bewildered by the developments of the last few years. It's been soul crushing. It's been extremely painful for me. I've lost friends. I've lost colleagues. I've been attacked by people who used to be on my side and no longer are. I can't figure out, have they changed or have I changed? It's maybe perhaps a little bit of both, but I think mainly they've changed because they're going along with things that I would have never imagined that they would support. So where does that leave me and us? Well, one thing that's for sure is you should not be supporting Republicans when what they're doing is supporting Donald Trump. I mean, before the 2018 election, I wrote a column for the Washington Post, which went viral, saying, as a lifelong Republican, I'm urging everybody to vote a straight Democratic Party ticket. Don't vote for any Republicans, because if you're voting for Republicans, you're voting for Donald Trump, because there is no Republican in Washington who is willing to stand up to Donald Trump on a consistent basis. And that's true. The handful who would stand up for him even occasionally, like Jeff Flake and Mark Sanford, they're no longer in Congress. They can't stay in office because of the fervor of the Trump base. And so I think it's incredibly important in 2020 that, again, Donald Trump has to be defeated, because, okay, it's bad enough that he's acting the way he's acting for 4 years. The voters, some of his voters anyway, have sort of an alibi. They can claim, well, we didn't know he was serious about some of the stuff that he said, or we just wanted to blow things up, or we wanted to shake things up, or we thought he was a great deal maker, or we thought he was really the guy that we saw on The Apprentice and he would somehow magically fix everything. There's various alibis you can concoct, and I'm sure you'll hear them if Donald Trump loses in 2020. But if he wins after all this, what does that say about the future of our democracy? What does that say about what kind of country we are? That you can get away with this kind of blatant obstruction of justice, racism, xenophobia, and then be rewarded at the ballot box. That, to me, our democracy will still survive, but it will be badly damaged. I mean, this, to me, would be a crushing blow, I think, to send about what kind of country we are and what kind of behavior we expect from our presidents and our leaders. That's why I think it's imperative that Donald Trump be defeated in 2020. I think it's also imperative on the Democrats to ensure that happens. And I think the way that Democrats can ensure that happening is not to be the mirror image of the Republican Party, which is rushing so far to the right. I don't think Democrats should make that mistake the other way and rush so far to the left. I think that's incredibly corrosive for our country as a whole. We should not be forced, like an interwar Europe, to have to choose between socialism and fascism as our governing philosophies. There ought to be a more centrist choice, and that's something that we've usually had in this country. But I think it's also bad politics because, I think Democrats are making a mistake if they're saying, Donald Trump is so awful, nobody will support him, so therefore we can push for our maximalist ideological agenda because people will support whoever we put up, and then we can enact this far left agenda. I wouldn't be so sure of that. I mean, I think there's a reasonable chance Donald Trump could actually win re-election. The economy is in good shape. I mean, we should not be in denial here. I mean, I understand there's going to be a lot of people shaking their heads in this room, but if you go to places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, it's a different story. There's still going to be a lot of people who are supporting Donald Trump. So you got to put up a candidate who can appeal to those kinds of voters, and in particular to some of those white working class high school graduates who are the core of the Trump support in those large Midwestern states. And so you have to think about who is going to appeal to them. Now, maybe it's possible that a Bernie Sanders actually could appeal to them, but my concern is that Bernie, in some ways like Trump, is a divider, not a uniter. And he divides not along racial or ethnic lines, but along economic lines. And he's somebody who has a large and devoted fan base, but is he really going to be somebody who can reach across the aisle, who can heal our country, who can bring us together? It sure doesn't seem like it to me. In fact, people like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, I fear, would be very easy prey for Donald Trump, because he wants to run his whole campaign demonizing Democrats as the socialists, as the people who want to create Venezuela in America. And he's, terrifying a lot of Republicans into making them think that if they don't support him, Ilhan Omar is going to be the next president of the United States. That is not true, obviously. You have the actual leadership of the Democratic Party is people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who are very reasonable, very centrist, and very moderate. But Donald Trump is doing his best to portray the Democrats as being these evil far-left radicals, and Democrats ought to be smart enough not to fall into that trap. And I think that's actually part of the appeal of somebody like a Pete Buttigieg is he's not falling into that trap, because he is somebody who is a mayor of a city in Indiana, a very conservative state, who can speak to people across the aisle. And I think, that's certainly the hope that Joe Biden can do that. Beto O'Rourke can do that. I think Kamala Harris can do that. Some of the other candidates have the potential to do that. But my hope is that as somebody who believes that it is imperative, not for policy reasons, but for the health of our democracy, to vote Donald Trump out of office, my hope is that Democrats in this primary season, and I'm not a Democrat, I'm an independent now, I'm not aligned here politically, but I would hope that Democrats would vote with their heads, not with their hearts, and choose somebody who can move to the center. If that in fact happens, I think there's a chance for a real realignment in American politics, where you will make Republicans a minority party for decades to come. Democrats can become a majority party, as they were from the 1930s up through the 1990s. I think that is the kind of shift that we can see in our politics, because Republicans are increasingly aligned with the white population base, which is shrinking as our country becomes a majority-minority country in the 2040s. So that's a historic opportunity for Democrats. My hope is that Democrats don't make the error that Abba Eden ascribed to Palestinians when he said that Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And that's something you can say of Democrats in the past as well. I hope they're smarter than that this time, because you hear this the boilerplate about every 4 years, every election is going to be the most important in our history. Generally, that's not the case. In 2020, I actually think it may well be the case that it's not just a question of partisan affiliation, which party dominates in Washington that's on the line, but what kind of democracy are we going to have? Are we going to revive our democracy, or are we going to go down the road to something very dark and menacing, in a place where most of us don't want to go? The good news is we're not there yet. We still have a chance to make our voice heard. We can still vote the rascal out of office, and that's something that I hope we will do. And I say this again as somebody who's not a Democrat, who was a lifelong Republican. Now I'm an unaffiliated centrist, but I really do think that the election in 2020 is really about the future of our democracy, and it's hard to imagine anything more important than that. Thank you.
And I'll let you take questions, and I'll give us some. So at this point, I'd like to ask students who would like to ask questions to line up at the microphone. I also want to make one brief announcement. I skipped a line in my introduction that I need to remedy right now, which is to say that this lecture was also supported by the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication. I'm very grateful. Dean Lukashevitz is right here. Can I have a round of applause and support for him? So students, if you could take your place, we have some time for some questions, and I'll let Mr. Boot respond to the questions, and I'll come back when we need to wrap up for questions, and then we'll move into the book signing phase of the evening. Thank you.
Hello, this is really low. What are some key issues that you believe that contenders for the Democratic nomination need to address in order to sway Trump's voting base, if that is even possible?
Well, that's a great question. And, did you guys hear the question? What are the key issues that Democrats need to address to sway Trump's voting base, if that's even possible? And I will stipulate that's, with a lot of folks, that's not possible. I mean, roughly, 30% of the country, I think, has theological loyalty to Donald Trump as their Lord and Savior. So you're not going to move those people away from Trump. But remember, his base of support is not 30%, it's about 40%. So I think that there's a certain number of Republicans and supporters who are less loyal to him and who are not absolutely fervent in their support. And you saw the consequence of them losing faith in November when Republicans suffered the biggest loss of House seats since 1974, 40 House seats, and they were wiped out in suburban moderate districts around the country, including, amazingly, Orange County, California, which is the heartbed of conservative republicanism. That's where Richard Nixon was born. Now, for the first time since the 1930s, Orange County does not have a single Republican representative in Congress. I mean, that's, for somebody like me who grew up in the 1980s when this was Reagan country, that's staggering. So, I think that there is a breaking point for some Republican voters. There is a breaking point for independents who have voted Republican in the past. And if Donald Trump is going to run, the kind of xenophobic campaign that he ran in 2018, it's going to backfire with some portion of his base. It's going to work with some, for sure. It worked in places like Florida and Georgia, but it backfired in a lot of suburban districts around the country. And so, I think Democrats need to think about how do we appeal to those suburban districts. And again, to pick up on the point I was making in my talk, I don't think the kind of policies that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are pushing are necessarily going to appeal to those college-educated, relatively upscale, moderate, economically conservative type of voters. I think it has to be a different kind of message, and I think it has to be certainly a less radical economic message, but fundamentally, you can certainly appeal to them on issues like healthcare. Democrats did that pretty effectively in 2018 without necessarily promising Medicare for All, which is a hugely expensive entitlement program costing trillions of dollars. And if you take it seriously, it's going to wipe out the private healthcare marketplace. It's going to force tens of millions of people to leave their current insurance providers. It's going to be incredibly disruptive. And so while Medicare for All sounds good in practice, once you get into the details, public support rapidly plummets when people understand that it involves tax increases, it involves losing your health insurance. So, it would be a mistake, I think, for Democrats to get too far, too programmatic and too radical in what they're offering. I think the message has to be one of uniting people, bringing them together, standing up for our democracy, common sense solutions. I think, a message kind of similar to the one that Barack Obama offered in 2008. When, remember what an amazing breakthrough it was for an African American to win the presidency. He had to reassure a lot of skittish white people that this was going to be okay, that they could support him and nothing bad would happen to them. And I think essentially whoever wins the Democratic nomination has to do the exact same thing in 2020, because there are a lot of people in the Trump base who look to him as their savior and protector from these evil caravans that are coming from Mexico and that are going to rape and pillage their neighborhoods, or from socialists who are going to recreate Venezuela in Ohio and going to take away their doctors and their health insurance, all sorts of bad things. And so you fundamentally need somebody who is reassuring, who can offer a message of uplift and hope, who is not threatening, who is not radical, who is not revolutionary. And again, that's, as I mentioned earlier, I think that's part of why, amazingly enough, Pete Buttigieg, a mayor of a town of 100,000, has kind of caught on, because he is that kind of reassuring guy, because he has been the mayor of this very Republican state, and he's spoken to people in the Midwest. I think others can do it. I mean, again, Cory Booker hasn't been getting a lot of attention, but he has a lot of experience doing that as well. I think part of the appeal of Joe Biden is he's a guy from Scranton, theoretically can appeal to white working class people. I think that's really the key for the Democratic Party. to reassure the Trump supporters that nothing bad is going to happen to them without Trump.
So in light of what you just said, you touched on it a little bit. What are some things that we can do as individuals and as a society to reduce partisan and ideological polarization?
That is a... Yeah. I mean, that's a great issue, and that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I'm actually involved in starting a little nonprofit organization called the Renew Democracy Initiative, along with one of your previous speakers, Bret Stephens, and Gary Kasparov, the great chess champion, Ann Applebaum, Larry Tribe of Harvard, former Senator Bob Kerrey, and others. And what we're basically trying to do is to revive the vital center of American politics, center left, center right, speaking out against the extremes on both sides, the populism, the extremism that really threatens our democracy. And I would hope that more people would join that cause. You don't have to join our group, although we're happy if you do. But I mean, there's other groups out there. There's other ways to organize. And I would say, don't be hostage to the political parties. I mean, 40% of Americans are neither Republicans nor Democrats. There is a hunger in this country for an alternative, and I think there's an outside chance that somebody like Macron can arise here, as did in France, and to beat both political parties and to offer a more centrist alternative. I don't know that's going to happen this time around. I don't think it's going to be Howard Schultz, but I think there is an opportunity here, and I think there's a hunger here, and I think we need to think about how do we organize, how do we make centrism sexy. And one of the things that I find online is, there are no centrist trolls. There's a lot of trolls on the left, there's a lot of trolls on the right. There are no centrist trolls. I think we somehow need to get some momentum, some vibrancy, some energy behind moderation and centrism. It should not be boring. This should be seen as the salvation of our democracy.
Hi, well, now I feel rather stupid because you kind of just touched on this, but I know that previously there hasn't really, it hasn't been seen that there's a viable third party, really, to take on the deeply entrenched Democratic and Republican parties. But do you think now, because we're in a time of politics that are pretty unprecedented in the US, that now is a time for a third party to emerge? But I know that you just kind of touched on it.
Yeah, well, it's very hard. I mean, the last time you had a successful third party in the United States was in the 1850s when the Republican Party replaced the Whig Party. So it's been a while. Even I'm not old enough to remember that. It's very hard to do because there's so many entrenched legal and governmental and political obstacles to having a third party. The two-party duopoly is so firmly entrenched. I think it's very hard to start from the grassroots. That's why the Libertarian Party, for example, has never really gone anywhere. As I was suggesting a second ago, I think there's an outside kind of moonshot chance if you have somebody who has credibility as an outsider to the system, like Emmanuel Macron in France running against the far right and the far left, somebody in the United States potentially like, General Jim Mattis, for example. I don't think he's actually going to run, but somebody like Mattis who could have great credibility as a centrist and, not somebody who's running as a vanity project, but really running to save the country. I don't think that people are not so entrenched in their partisan identities that would be impossible. I could imagine somebody winning the presidency as neither a Democrat or a Republican, and then realigning American politics after having won the presidency. But it's incredibly difficult. It's a moonshot, and I don't see anybody right now who's going to run in 2020 and make that happen, sadly.
Any other questions from students? Yeah? And then I'll invite community members if you want to line up the mic.
Hi, thanks for coming to Hofstra. My question is about you were talking about Donald Trump being authoritarian or maybe a fascist. My question was, what fascist or authoritarian policies has he maybe enacted or alluded to enacting? Just touch more on that. I think that's an interesting part of the Trump presidency.
Well, I mean, certainly policies like, separating children from their parents at the border, imprisoning children in cages. I think this is certainly an inhumane policy. certainly the way that Donald Trump has assaulted the rule of law in the ways that, some of the ways I enumerated at the beginning. I mean, for example, the fact that he is now defying congressional subpoenas. He is defying the clear letter of the law to provide his taxes to the House Ways and Means Committee, all the ways in which he has obstructed justice in the ways that are listed by Muller. What I would say about Trump is I would certainly not say that fascism or authoritarianism has descended on America. What I would say is that he has fascist and authoritarian instincts, and his fascist and authoritarian instincts run up against the fact that we have a very strong rule of law. And so things that he has tried to do, like, for example, banning Muslims, very, very hard to do because there were all these legal challenges, and he had to substantially dilute that ban before it would pass muster in the Supreme Court. And that's true of a whole bunch of things because, he's talked about changing the libel laws basically to punish his enemies in the press. He's not able to do that. He's certainly able to call us the enemy of the people, but he's not able to lock us up, which, if this were Italy in the 1930s or Argentina in the 1950s, maybe he would be doing that. But so I think we're very lucky and very blessed that we have one of the longest lived constitutional republics in the world. We have a very strong rule of law tradition. We have a strong judiciary. We have a strong independent press corps. We haven't seen much pushback from Congress, but now we're seeing serious pushback from the House now that it's in Democratic hands. And so, again, I think that he is somebody who has authoritarian instincts, and in a different country, in a different historical epoch, he might well become an authoritarian in the way that you're seeing now Viktor Orban, for example, undermining democracy in Hungary. And if our democracy had been created in the 1990s, that may well be happening here. Luckily, our democracy was created long before that, and so we have a much more durable rule of law tradition, which President Trump has not managed to usurp, but he is certainly undermining it. And the fact that he is essentially going to get away with blatant obstruction of justice, I think, sends a very dangerous signal to future office holders about the kind of conduct that we expect from our president.
Thank you.
Yes, hello. I'd be interested in your thoughts about whether you think the issue of climate change is going to become a critical issue in the next presidential election. And a corollary, do you have any thoughts about the roots of Donald Trump's opinions and policy about climate change? Because I'm sure 4 years ago he couldn't give a damn. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think obviously climate change is a hugely important issue, one of the most important in the world. I mean, it's literally the future of the world. And I think it is very striking that Donald Trump and most of the Republican Party, they're basically climate change deniers. They are denying what 95% of scientists agree is in fact the case. And in hindsight, I have to say, in some ways, this was kind of a gateway drug, I think, for accepting a lot of other ludicrous claims, like the notion that President Obama was not actually born in the United States, or that Ted Cruz's father was involved in the Kennedy assassination, or that President Obama was wiretapping Trump Tower. Name your conspiracy theory. In some ways, the fact that President Trump and so much of the Republican Party refuses to believe the scientific consensus on climate change is kind of their signal that they're abandoning fact, they're abandoning rationality, they're entering the realm of conspiracy theory and wishful thinking and ideology rather than what the facts show. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, not just for the future of the planet, not just because it makes it almost impossible to have real action to address climate change, but also for what it means about the future of American politics when you have one major party in the grip of what I really regard as irrationality. But take it from me as a former Republican, there is very strong pressure to conform. That if you actually speak out about climate change, for example, or if you speak out about maybe it's not such a good idea for anybody in the United States to be able to buy a military-grade assault weapon, if you say things that I think now are sort of obvious, you're going to get ostracized from the Republican Party. And there's a very powerful mechanism there to keep people in line. And sadly, climate change is one of those issues on which has now become a partisan issue, and it shouldn't be.
Thank you. Just a fast comment before a fast question. You mentioned bigotry before that, before George Wallace, but I think we did have one elected. I think Spiro Agnew, you could possibly put in the category as an elected national. You touched on it during your talk. Have you changed your opinion on your former conservative views after all of this? You touched on it just a little bit, but have you changed any of your thoughts on where you were?
Yes and no. I mean, I have changed some of my views. I mean, it's been a fascinating ideological journey because I realized to what extent confirmation bias is in some ways the most powerful drug in the world. And when you identify self-consciously with a political party or a political movement, you tend to see the world in ways that conform to your ideology. This is not only true on the right, it's also true on the left. But, leaving the Republican Party has made me realize, why didn't I speak out about some of these things? And it wasn't, I don't think anything that I was, there was not a lot of things that I was saying before that I would necessarily disagree with now, although there were some. I mean, for example, in that book, The Corrosion of Conservatism, I talk about, in hindsight, what a monumental error was for me to support the Iraq War, and that was kind of an instance of Republican groupthink in action. But I'm also speaking out now more about issues like, gun control and the fact that we have a homicide rate many times that of any other advanced industrialized country. I'm speaking out about issues like climate change and the need to address those issues. And I would have never done that in the past, and in part because I didn't, I kind of defined my own identity in kind of this narrow foreign policy, defense policy kind of way, but also because, and it wasn't because I was an active climate denier or an active opponent of gun control or anything like that, but I just chose not to speak out about those issues because I didn't really think about it. But I think in hindsight, I kind of instinctively understood it was too dangerous to speak out about those issues if I was going to remain a member in good standing of the right, if I was going to remain a conservative and a Republican, that I would be ostracized if I spoke out about those things. And so I chose not to speak. And now that I'm free of the shackles of the right, largely self-imposed, I am speaking out about those things. But it makes me realize to what extent, again, the confirmation bias, the way people see the world, the way they want to see it, and the way that their fellow ideologues want them to see it. And that's why I'm very leery of ideology now on the left or the right. And I don't want to be a Democrat. I don't want to be a Republican. I really want to be a free thinker, somebody in the center who tries to take the issues based on the merits.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming to Hofstra. It's the day after Election Day, 2020, and Donald Trump loses. And all of a sudden, like he did with Hillary, but he won the election, but before the election, he was saying that everything was rigged and that he refuses to leave office. What do you think about that? Especially, you get people that are down at the border, the militia, and I just read today in the paper that they want to assassinate Obama and Hillary Clinton. So I'm just, kind of worried about something really nasty happening if he doesn't win the election.
I think you're right to be concerned because I think it's almost a certainty that if he loses, he will claim the election was rigged. I mean, Donald Trump is one of the few people who won an election and still claimed it was rigged, right? I mean, that's very bizarre. He said there were millions of illegal aliens who voted against him. Otherwise, he would have won the popular vote, which is deranged. But so you can imagine what he's going to say if he actually loses the election. There is no question he will claim that it was, caravans coming from Mexico voting him out of office. It's immoral, unconstitutional, it's a coup d'etat. I don't doubt for a second he's going to say that. Now, luckily, we don't live in the Republic of Fredonia, and, the Secret Service is not going to surround the White House and prevent Donald Trump from being evicted, okay? On January 20th, following the election, if he lost the election, he is going to leave the White House. I can guarantee you that. He is not going to stay in power, but you're right that it's a very volatile situation, and you have to wonder what are his followers going to do, because there are a lot of heavily armed nutcases in this country. I mean, just a few months ago, you had this Trump follower in Florida who was sending mail bombs to people like George Soros and Hillary Clinton, my colleagues at CNN, and there's a lot of others out there like him. So I think it's a very dangerous, volatile situation where I think it's all the more important that leading Republicans, for once, put their country above their party and speak out ahead of the election about the importance of accepting the election results, and then after the election, make it clear that there was no cheating, there was no fraud, this was a lawful election. In fact, the very same thing that just happened in Ukraine just a couple of days ago, where Poroshenko lost the Ukrainian presidency and recognized Vladimir Zelensky as the rightful president of Ukraine. I mean, I never thought I would be saying like Ukraine ought to be a model for our democracy, but there's something to that now.
Thank you.
Given the rather liberal use of anti-Semitic tropes, do you think that Trump has enabled anti-Semitism, or on some level is a closet anti-Semite?
Well, I don't know if he's a closet anti-Semite or not, but I would say that he has definitely enabled anti-Semitism, and I know this personally because, I lived in this country for, I don't know, what is it, like 45 years or something like that, without ever encountering overt anti-Semitism. Now, that's probably because I lived a sheltered life in places like LA and Berkeley and New York and so forth, but I never encountered anti-Semitism until 2015 when Donald Trump started running for president, and all of a sudden my email inbox, my Twitter account filled up with this anti-Semitic garbage. I started getting, pictures of me in a gas chamber with Trump in a Nazi uniform pulling the lever to gas me. And this wasn't unique to me. This was very common. If you look at the statistics compiled by the ADL, there's been a spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the last few years since Trump came on the scene. And clearly, I think there's a sense on the white supremacist fringe that Donald Trump is enabling them because he's not condemning them. He seems to be kind of winking and nudging at them like he did after Charlottesville, where again, let's remember, the protesters were chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and then Donald Trump says there were very fine people on both sides. Wow. So that's, there's a reason why Richard Spencer and David Duke and others, why they're enthusiastic fans of Donald Trump, even though they feel like he doesn't go far enough. Now, there's a little bit of a paradox there, obviously, because Trump is also a staunch supporter of Israel. His daughter is married to somebody who is Jewish. He has Jewish grandchildren. And so I don't see, a lot of overt displays of anti-Semitism, but certainly in the way that he talks, associating basically Jews with money making, or speaking to the Republican Jewish coalition and talking about as if Israel was their government rather than the United States. I mean, he falls into some of these classic anti-Semitic tropes, but I think it's not that he's particularly anti-Semitic. I just think that he's basically racist, and he's encouraging racists with his rhetoric in general, and certainly, these white supremacists are violently anti-Jewish as well as anti-Black, anti-Muslim, anti-Latino, you name it. So I think it is a very, Trump has some Jewish support, certainly because of his support for Israel, but I think most American Jews are in the same position as I am. I mean, I can agree with him on some things with Israel, but I abhor the rest of what he stands for.
Thank you.
This will be our last question.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for this incredible talk. I learned so much listening to you, put so much in perspective. My question has to do with what you said early on in your talk about tribalism. Your friend told you that elections are decided on tribal allegiance rather than ideas. If you still believe that, I don't know whether you do or not, but if you do, and if this election will be determined with tribal allegiance rather than ideas, what thoughts, suggestions might you give to either lessen tribalism or move Trump's tribe out to perhaps a different tribe?
Well, I think, that goes back to the question that the gentleman asked earlier about how do Democrats appeal to the Trump base, and I think it kind of comes back to being non-threatening and not doing things that will reinforce that tribalism. And that's, for example, why I think it's a mistake for Democrats to be talking about reparations for slavery. I mean, that is a very complicated and weighty historical issue that we can debate in an academic way. But if you're actually going to be talking about that on the campaign trail, the message that a lot of Trump's tribe is going to get is you're anti-white people, and somehow, Trump has made it seem to a lot of white people that they're the victims of discrimination in America. Now, that's crazy. That's not accurate now. It's not accurate historically. But it doesn't matter if it's accurate. They actually believe it, and they vote So you'd better be concerned about what they think, and you should not be playing to their prejudices, however wrong-headed you may think that they are, because for practical political purposes, you got to win an election. It's not a debating society. It's not to make a point about moral justice, which we can argue about and debate. It's to win the freaking election, okay? And you're not going to win it by reinforcing their tribal allegiances. That is very, very dangerous to do. And so I would advise Democrats not to do that. Again, I would fundamentally advise them to talk in ways that are not threatening to Trump's base. And if they want to figure out how to do that, just call up old videotapes of Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, because they both did it successfully. And that's why they were both two-term Democratic presidents. In fact, the only two-term Democratic presidents since FDR. They actually figured out how to talk to a lot of ordinary Americans who are not necessarily sympathetic to the Democratic Party ideologically, and so borrow those rhetorical cues. It's not rocket science, but they were not talking the way that Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren are talking.
In a moment, we're going to, just a minute. In a moment, we're going to be ready for folks to buy books and get an autograph. So that will happen in the back of the room. And now is the time to thank Mr. Booth for an extraordinarily thought-provoking presentation. Thank you so much. That was great.